Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody's well, and we are going to be doing our exam review of GCSE statistics. So what I thought we would do is we just have a look first of all at some of the general comments around the summer series and some of the things that have been positive, some of the things that we could still work a little bit further on, and then go into a bit more detail about some of the questions and where there's sort of a teaching implication really of something that perhaps students and maybe even staff as well are perhaps not quite as aware of. So those things that are the standard techniques, so we've got tally charts, probability, two-way tables, those have all done particularly well in this series. Now it might well be, and we'll have a look at some of these questions a bit later on, that actually it's where there is that crossover with the normal maths GCSE content and the stats content as well. Those extended response questions, there was a slight improvement, but schools would still benefit from students having more practice on this type of question as extended response, because the quality of those responses was kind of variable. The topics which students are less familiar with, so things like the risk and the index numbers, were perhaps answered less successfully. And again, handwriting, I've put it in capital letters there, and this isn't new. This is something that again was also on the normal maths GCSE as well, students being able to write legibly so that the examiners can actually read it, and that handwriting was a real problem, particularly on some of those extended responses. Reminding students as well about the exam technique of time management and looking at how many minutes they're going to use, how many marks a question is, and things like that, just those general exam techniques. There was a significant number of questions where it was clear that students hadn't checked their answers, and I've got a couple of those to show you as well to sort of see where there was an obvious mistake that students could have picked on which lost them valuable marks. Where students were asked to explain, assess and interpret, the data suggests there is a slight improvement on previous series, but those interpretation questions in particular, being asked to interpret something, is still proving tricky for students, particularly at the foundation tier. Then something as simple as using the correct equipment. When students are being asked to draw a diagram, making sure that they're using a ruler and a sharp pencil. We'll have a look at the box plot question a bit later on, where students lost marks because their box plot wasn't drawn accurately enough, even as simple, just being one box out, they lost the mark there. And actually that would have been something which they clearly understood the process. They just haven't used their equipment correctly, and showing that full working out. On the higher, again, so, very sort of similar sort of trends there. The techniques like the box plots, the use of the capture recapture, really well attempted. But then some of the things like the use of the normal distribution continue to be a bit of a challenge for students. So we have a look at some of the questions then directly then from the papers and the implications for the teaching. We'll just have a look at foundation paper 1, then some crossover questions, then foundation and higher, and then foundation paper 2, and so on, sort of follow that process. So with this question here, for those of you not familiar with the paper, nice, easy sort of getting students into it with a pictogram question. Part A and part B were fine, but then part C I've put on here because it asks them to explain why the use of the key may not be appropriate. And for this question here, it was students' understanding of the word explain and failing to reference that in their answer. And that's a bit of an exam technique, really, that they haven't actually referred to the use of the key. They sort of started to waffle a little bit around the answer. So sort of supporting students with knowing that where it's asking them specifically to explain using something, but they have to actually make sure they reference that then in their answer. On question 4, I'll just give you a second just to have a read of this question, particularly those people that are not familiar with the paper. So with this question, again, it's whether it's that sort of exam stress or that panic in the exam in part B that students gave perhaps 2 advantages or 2 disadvantages, or actually gave a response to primary data. So getting them to underline those keywords that it's 1 advantage and 1 disadvantage, and it's using secondary data. And even though on the questions there on the answer thing, it's got an advantage and a disadvantage, they still gave 2 of both, 2 of one or 2 of another. Okay, and then one of the common issues there we said was making those common errors and checking answers. And question 5 here just required students to work out at the mean or finding, I think the first question was to say whether there was a mode, and then they had to work out the mean. And actually it was as simple with this one as students just not checking that they'd inputted 9 numbers. They'd only they've missed out a number, and checking that the correct number of values have been used, particularly on a calculation which they find relatively straightforward. It's easier for them to make a mistake because they've become a bit complacent with it. So actually just go back and check their answer, and if they've missed out one of those values, particularly one of the bigger ones, whether that changes their their mean and makes it sort of, you know, that the sense doesn't apply. Okay, so if we have a look then at the crossover questions, again, I'll just give you a minute to have a quick sort of look at the context there of that question. This was one with the population pyramid. And I've put down there as well the information about the average score that students scored on this question, and then the grade that they subsequently got. Obviously, the top is the higher and the bottom is the foundation, because I just think sometimes that's quite an interesting bit of information there, particularly if we're starting to think about tiers of entry as well. It's quite a useful thing for sort of thinking about with tiers of entry. With this question, students needed to show their working out. The question explicitly says you must show your working, and then students who didn't then obviously didn't get the credit for this, and so it was answered quite poorly. Maybe it comes back to that understanding of the command word. You know, you must show your working out. We were always saying you've got to show your working out, but actually when it explicitly says you must show your working out, we need to train students to understand that that means there will be credit given for that, not just that we think it's a good habit to get into. That students in this question weren't given a mathematical reason and just sort of gave worded answers which didn't, you know, which scored no marks. They had to give numerical reasons for that. Talking about the rounding there, they needed the comment to go with that. Okay, so this on the crossover on paper 1, so this is 14C on foundation and question 3C on higher. Again, just to give you a minute just to read it. So it says there that linear interpolation is nearly always tested on foundation, but it was still answered particularly poorly on both papers. Most students didn't attempt part C from foundation, and those who did, a lot of them attempted to calculate the mean instead of the median. The 1 mark was given if the correct class interval was identified, so they could still get something even if they've, you know, just identified the class the interval that it comes from. In higher, it was, you know, slightly better with some correct responses, but there were still a large group of students who just simply identified the class interval and didn't then know how to apply linear interpolation. And a few responses calculated an estimate of the mean rather than working out the median on higher. So again, that's something which obviously we're fairly confident that that's something that's coming up, that linear interpolation, but actually making students confident with what that actually means and what they have to do in order to do that. But if nothing else, if they can just identify the class interval, that they will still get the credit for that. So, you know, we're talking about trying to get as many marks as possible on as many questions, even if it's not full marks, then that's something that students could potentially be doing. Okay, quite a lot of reading in this one. So again, I'll just give you 30 seconds or so, just have a quick read through this question. Okay, so for this one, we've got method A, which is then we've got systematic and we've got stratified sampling. So we've got 3 different types of sampling methods. For each one, they've got to identify their sampling method first of all, and then they discuss whether that is an appropriate way to select the employees. It does also say at the bottom there, as part of the discussion, you should also state with a reason which of these is the most appropriate for the directors to use. And most pleasingly, most students were able to gain some marks on this question. They were able to get something. They got 2 marks for identifying all 3 of those sampling methods, but they still got 1 mark, even if they'd only managed to identify 1 or 2 of them. The most common incorrect comment on method A was where the students were talking about the method would lead to a sample which was proportional to the sizes of the shops. Commenting on the appropriateness of method B, students found that much more challenging. That method A seemed to be, you know, particular, and C, they seemed to be fairly comfortable with, but with method B, the systematic sampling was the one that they struggled to sort of make comments on. They were often doing things like describing the method again, so pretty much just repeating the method or explaining how it would be carried out in practical terms rather than actually commenting on the appropriateness of it. And they need to be careful not to contradict themselves. So some students were doing some things like where they were saying something was biased and unbiased, or they were saying it was representative and unrepresentative. So students just need to be careful with not contradicting themselves within an answer. So, for example, on method A, they were allowed things like to say the method is not random, but then it was condoned if they said not everyone has an equal chance. Now, that's really quite subtle for students to understand the difference between those two things. And I think this question is really prime for an activity in a classroom, to have all the different methods of sampling and for students to be, first of all, identifying the type of method that it is, and then talking about the advantages or disadvantages or the appropriateness in a context, and then really looking at the language they've used and checking whether the language that they've used would gain the marks, or giving the students some exemplar answers from the PDF, which I'll show you where to find that on the Emporium at the end of the session. But looking at, really getting students to mark this kind of question rather than us just marking them and saying, that wouldn't get you the marks because it needs to say this. Getting students to really look at where the marks come from. For me personally, I think they find the language use of this kind of question quite difficult, quite tricky to make sure that they get those full marks, and they struggle to see the difference between something which is acceptable and something which is then either not acceptable or which is condoned. Sort of skipping a little bit through then paper 1 to question 10, standard deviation and standardized scores. This was actually done relatively well by the majority of students, and using that statistical calculations that, it's nice to see that most students knew how to do a standardized score. And again, we're sort of, we're kind of getting to the middle of the higher paper. So, it was a good question for students to get some marks on. Almost all students who used the correct method then got the accuracy marks by arriving at the correct answer. So that was great. Although some students confused the idea of a standardized score and skewness and correlation. So again, maybe not quite being secure with the terminology that they're using. They also didn't realize that they were making a comment, a conclusion didn't state that the conclusion was wrong. So making sure that they know they've actually got to state whether it's right or wrong. And just a very, very few students, very sort of a minority of students, didn't use a statistical calculation in their answer. But I think there was something about that wording there that it didn't seem to, like, where we said about the one we show you're working out, students didn't use their working out or didn't use numerical answers. This question they did, the majority of students did. They did do a statistical calculation and then made a comment on it as well. And question 12, the question with the dice. There are lots of examples of where students listed binomial conditions, but then didn't actually write them in the context of the question. And I think that's important, that it needed to be in the context of this with the dice. The common incorrect answers for this one included things where students basically said it wouldn't be a fair experiment, or the dice need to be thrown in the same way to make it fair, despite the fact that in the question it says 4 ordinary 6-faced dice. Okay, so students sort of repeating what's already in the question seems to be a bit of a common thing, or contradicting what is already in the question. Part B of the question was to calculate the probability that all 4 dice land on a 6 and give your answer as a fraction. Some students didn't give their answer as a fraction. Again, easy things to miss out. Making life difficult by converting to decimals or rounding too early. The most common incorrect answer there was to just multiply by 4 rather than raising it to the power of 4. So again, just going back to those sort of basic probability skills of understanding the difference between multiplying by 4 or doing it to the power of 4, but also not making it difficult for themselves. They just do it as a fraction, then the answer kind of falls out much nicer than if they start trying to make it into decimals part way through. And then part C, calculate the probability that at least 2 of the 4 dice land on a 6 and give your answer as a fraction. Again, I've just put at the bottom there the mean score for this question. This one was out of 3. So I think there's some quite interesting there, sort of that bottom end there, the grade 6, 5 and 4 students, their scores. It did prove more challenging, the ramping up of difficulty within that question. We'd expect part C to be more difficult, and it was. They just didn't use the n-choose-r aspect of that binomial calculation. That was the most common error with that. So again, sort of thinking about how we use that. Right, okay, I will move on now to paper 2. Nice paper 2 question, question 4, a really lovely two-way table question. Nice and typical of a common GCSE paper question, answered really well, and perhaps it's that commonality there with the GCSE paper and that expectation. It wasn't anything that was new to them. So those questions which are common, students are answering particularly well. And that somebody at the start said that they were having to teach this alongside Maths GCSE with no additional time. And perhaps that's where sort of carefully looking at what is common to both, and perhaps not needing to sort of teach it twice, or being able to shuffle things around a little bit there. The second part of this question then was a comparative pie chart, comparing two pie charts with each other. And I've just put on there the average score there for the two questions. So two-way tables out of two, you can see obviously students did a lot better than they did with the pie charts question. A lot of students wrote their answers on the pie chart, didn't show the calculation. And again, the command in there is telling them you must show the calculation. Some students used their protractors and said that their protractor was the way that they'd done it. So that they had used that, they wrote that their calculation was to use their protractor and class that as their working out. So sort of making sure students understand what the expectation is with that kind of question. Now, this one's a funny one. This one made me laugh when I was looking at this one. Explain what is meant by a simple random sample. A lot of students just wrote a sample taken randomly, just repeating the words in the question. That won't get them the marks. The average score, the mean score on this was 0.19, okay, because most students who got this one wrong had simply put a sample taken randomly without really going into the detail of what that language actually means. So not just repeating the words, but really knowing what that means. Okay, part B then. So this question again was about a questionnaire that the manager of a health centre was talking about, to carrying out a questionnaire and then completing the questionnaire at home and returning it. Assess the manager's plan to opinions of the people. Again, few students recognise that actually a questionnaire is a good way to gather opinions. That, you know, it's not necessarily a bad thing. But what they did was they were questioning the motives of the person. So things like whether they would ask biased or leading questions. Well, at this point, we don't know what the questions are in the questionnaire. We just know that she wants to use a questionnaire. They started questioning things like whether or not they should do it online. Would they return a questionnaire? The word there is to assess, that command word. And I've put there 3 marks, 3 reasons. And that's what I don't know if it's Helen, sorry, in the chat or somebody who put about talking to them about, you know, if you've got 6 marks and 10 lines or 10 marks and 6 lines, whatever it is, you know, you've got 3 marks, want 3 comments for something like this. So questions which were acceptable were things like, you know, not random, excludes any without an appointment, many may not return the questionnaire, likely to be a small sample, could include some who are not registered. Questionnaire is a good way to collect opinions. So, you know, quite a lot of things that they could say there. But what some students did was take one of those and then expand it. So thinking that saying something like, you know, many might not return a questionnaire, they should do it online. If they're relying on the post, then it might not happen, you know, those sorts of things, and making the comments about their comment rather than writing 3 different assessments of the questionnaire. In part C, then you're given a question, what do you think about the 5 minutes currently allowed for appointments? This is not a good question. Give one reason why. The point there is that you are told this is not a good question. You know, don't give opinion on the actual question. It's that you're told it's not a good question. You've then got to explain why. So many students scored no marks on this because they just stated that it was an open question. They've got to assess that question. They've got to give the reason why that is a bad question. So the impression is that not all students were reading it or fully understanding the context of it. A good number of students who did score a marks submitted multiple responses. So although there's only 1 mark, they gave multiple responses, and they just need to be careful there that they're not, I suppose, wasting time as well, or doing something which then contradicts what they've already said when it is only 1 mark. Okay, question 9. This is one of the topics that, you know, sort of students struggle with a little bit, the absolute risk of rainfall for a day in April. Good question potentially for tier of entry decisions. Whether this is a good discriminator question. It is only on foundation. It wasn't a crossover question, but it is quite a good one to sort of maybe ask. On the foundation, very few students were able to calculate the answer. Most actually left it blank. You know, with the most common incorrect answer was 0.13. Generally answered well. There's some students who didn't manage to answer that question well. Now this one's an interesting one, the box plot question. Again, just to give you a second just to read a couple of bits. And again, at the bottom there, I've just put the average score out of 3, the 3 marks, just to sort of show you what students were getting on that question. The majority of students who tried this question, part A was to draw the box plot for rugby. The majority of students who attempted it did get at least 1 mark on this question for drawing the general shape of a box plot. And perhaps the hint is in the question. They know what the general shape of a box plot is because they've already got one drawn there for them. Many students who only scored 2 out of the 3, their 3rd mark was from not accurately drawing it, from missing it by a box. And that's what I said at the start about making sure they've got a sharp pencil and a ruler and that they're really accurate with their drawing. And again, I don't know whether that comes down to something, you know, some of the stamina around these sorts of things. or whether it's something that we're not asking students to do quite as much, whether we've done more of the comparison, whether this was the kind of topic that perhaps during COVID we sort of put to one side because there was a drawing element of it. I don't know, but just getting students to actually read the boxes carefully, read the data carefully, and make sure that they're plotting it really, really carefully. But a significant proportion of students did manage to get the full 3 marks on that question. It was a reasonably well answered question. Now, part B asked them to compare the 2 distributions of heights, give 3 comparisons, and interpret one of your comparisons. So I think the reason this question was perhaps more tricky for students and wasn't answered quite as well was students understanding the difference between a comparison and interpretation and knowing how to do that. So I've just put up here some of the things that were acceptable for comparisons and then what the interpretation of that actually means. So comparisons were done reasonably well. It was the interpretation which wasn't done quite so well. Generally, students were able to compare the medians and they did that reasonably well, but a few just quoted the figures. They then didn't interpret that in the context of the question. A few confused what the average the box plot used, so they were talking about the mean instead of the median. Many were able to compare the range, but just quoted the figures. So again, they're just quoting the figures and making the comparison, but without actually making the correct interpretation. And then a few sort of were getting the errors, including sort of, confusing the positive and negative skew, saying that basketball had a symmetrical skew, which wasn't allowed. A few students did say which they've got the negative skew, which was acceptable when considering the whiskers. Too many students were comparing the lower quartile and getting the full marks on that question for that. The interpretation, the most common correct answer, came from interpreting the median. So most students who were able to do this well made an interpretation and a comparison of the medians. And maybe that's where you sort of throw your weight with that kind of thing, making sure they understand they're going to get the marks for that one. Those who tried to interpret the range and the interquartile ranges were less successful on that part of the question. And again, I think that probably comes down to that extended responses and understanding what the box plots are and understanding how to interpret those as well. That's quite an interesting question, I think, there, because those are nice marks, but they're difficult. Students struggle with the interpretation of a box plot, not just the comparison of it. Question 11, investigating percentage of population living in an urban area, suggest a hypothesis could be used. And sort of stressing really there that a hypothesis is not a question, it's a statement which you're then going to test whether that statement is true or not. A lot of students wrote their hypothesis as a question and they missed the word urban in both tiers. They just missed within there that there was something about urban populations. And then moving on to part B and part C for this question then. So given a reason why a scatter diagram is an appropriate diagram to use, many students had the right idea, but they were forgetting about using the correct language. They were talking about how it could show a pattern, but not using the word correlation. And then even students who got the mark for the urban population, most didn't get the second mark for the correct reasoning. So again, they got part A, they didn't necessarily get part C there. So just making sure that the language that they used about the explanatory variable, they didn't know what that actually meant, or if they gave the right definition of that, they didn't know the reason for it. Part D on this question, explain giving statistical reason whether or not the scatter diagram supports your hypothesis. A large number of students only got 1 mark because they gave that it was a correlation, but they missed that it was positive correlation. And then part E, unsurprisingly, was actually the best answer. They'd given the mean point of the data. Most students remembered to actually make sure their line of best fit went through that quadrant there, 63.9, 77.8. Some students, they suspect probably just by eye were doing this, and some just got lucky and managed to make sure it was within the tolerance of that coordinate. I think for me, the teaching implication for me of this is actually Key Stage 3 and how I incorporate some of this question, all of this question, in fact, into my work in Key Stage 3 rather than waiting until Key Stage 4. So when we're doing statistics or when we're doing scatter diagrams, using some of these types of questions in Key Stage 3 rather than always the questions about, temperature and ice cream and things like that. But actually having a look, starting to get students to design a hypothesis before they do something, talking to science about how are they talking about hypothesis testing and so on in Key Stage 3, and making sure that students are understanding that. The other problem again with this was students not using the correct equipment, so just not using a ruler, so trying to draw a line of best fit freehand, just something as simple as that where students are going to lose the marks. And then finally, the interpretation of the gradient. Students really struggle to sort of interpret what the gradient actually means. And a lot of students, or some students, attempted to actually work out the gradient of their line, but then without actually understanding what the gradient actually means in relation to a line of best fit in a context. Higher students was slightly better with this question, as you would expect. Very few were able to actually quantify that relationship between the gradient and the context of the question. So as you would expect, the question has got harder, apart from part E was answered particularly well. That was the best part answered of the question. But then looking at how we interpret that data, and again, it comes back to that word interpretation, knowing how to use it, but actually being able to interpret it is very, very different. This was a histogram question. So students got a histogram, and then they had to use that histogram to answer some questions. The success for part C was very much linked with part B. So students who got part B right were more likely to get part C right. Students were pretty good at using the area of histograms. Again, whether or not this is because it's a crossover question with GCSE, with the normal GCSE series. It was a 4-mark question, this. Quite a lot of work to do on this question. It was not uncommon for students here to omit to comment on the reliability. And that, again, that's that sort of key word within that sentence there is reliability. Comment on the reliability of your conclusion. The average score on this question was actually only 1. The mean score was 1.84, with grade 8-9 students getting an average of 3.41 and 2.92 respectively. So, quite a tough question. Students found this part of the question quite difficult, and it mainly comes down to that not commenting on the reliability of the data that they've got. Okay, so some of the resources then to kind of help you. If you haven't previously used exemplars, these are superb. They're really, really powerful teaching tool. We use them for CPD. We also use them for students as well. So you've got some exemplars there of student responses and the marks that they would have got and the reasons why they would or they wouldn't have got the marks. I use these both with staff and with students. I think they're superb. I think they're fantastic. I use the exemplars for the GCSE series as well. For something like statistics, where that use of language is absolutely crucial, and those subtle differences are sometimes really difficult for students and staff when they're marking to necessarily spot. I think the use of exemplars is, if you do nothing else, then you use the exemplars. In terms of the other things that I've used there in the resources section, I've also used where I got those grades from was from the skills map. This is really interesting for you to be able to compare the average score that students then went on to achieve. There's whole training videos and things as well, and I know there have previously been sessions on how to use the skills maps as well, plus for things like tier of entry decisions, various other things. I think it's fantastic. I think it's a really, really useful tool for just being able to go, and somebody said about comparing some questions and going and looking like, well, what did they get on pictogram questions in 2019? What's the comparison between that and now? Has there been a change? The resources in the exemplars now, they've had a wonderful new revamp and a bit of an update on the Emporium. It's really easy now to find. There's also a banner on them. If anyone's been on it in the last sort of couple of weeks, there's this fantastic banner that says new. So if there's something which has gone into that filing cabinet which is new, you can kind of keep clicking through any one of the ones that's new until you get to that point. So you can now quickly find when something is being updated or when something has been added to one of the filing cabinets that you regularly use. And everyone will have a similar sort of filing idea to when you're on your computer, you've got the resources, you go to resources. I know which filing cabinets I use on a regular basis, and now I can see when something has been added to it because it's got this red banner on it that's new. So again, with the resources and the GCSE statistics one, the filing cabinet is there. The exemplars are on the Maths Emporium. If you've not already signed up to the Maths Emporium, then sort of get logged on in there. There's a filing cabinet for GCSE statistics, and then within there's a filing cabinet that says exemplar materials, and you can see there it looks like that. It's a PDF. It's exactly that there. It's just that link there that you can just then download. That is it from me. I hope that's been useful for people as a sort of a whistle-stop tour of the 4 papers from the summer series with some of the key learning points as well. So David just put in the chat there, I'd be interested to know if some of the issues seen this year were worse than last few examining years as a result of pupils lacking the practice during the COVID years. Something that we discussed in one of the GCSE feedback sessions, actually just going right back to the start there about the handwriting and whether actually students' ability to write extended answers or even just writing legibly is being impacted by COVID because everything was done online, and actually that expectation of how much was still done with a pen and paper, perhaps was lacking a little bit. But I do certainly think anecdotally that there is a correlation between the sort of the students' ability to write mathematically and the amount of online learning that the amount of stuff that we were using online platforms, and that perhaps there was sort of some of that experience was lacking in those sort of formative years with that. Helen's put there that subjects have noted a lack of exam stamina and writing during mocks, and I think that would definitely be my experience as well. Students, their stamina in completing mocks and over a prolonged period of time, a number of exams one after the other, definitely something that we need to have on our radar. How do you best improve poor exam stamina? It's a really interesting question, Alan. I think one of the things that we're doing is we are building in exam questions, making it regular practice of exam questions in silence, that expectation that they have to sit in silence. It's not a discussion, it's not a group work, it's working in silence. As part of we have an intervention cycle where our lessons, year 11s have an extra lesson over lunchtime. Things are sort of shuffled around a bit, so our Thursday lesson over lunchtime is all exam practice, and that's pretty much what we're doing. Okay, so Kay said, yeah, pretty much mirrors what I see in the class. And I think I would agree as well. But yeah, these are all common issues which I would have in my classroom as well. Oh, that's interesting. Helen's put there about giving expectations of how much writing is to be expected. A double period per fortnight. Now that's good. I've heard of quite a few schools where they've got these double periods and doing practice paper in exam conditions in that double period, or sort of doing walking, talking mocks on a regular basis in there. But yeah, I think we've just got to keep pushing them, really, haven't we, with those exam practice that is, for a lot of mine, it's actually just sitting in silence. That's what a lot of mine are struggling with, is sitting in silence for extended periods of time because they've not really had to do it. And I think because when they would have been in sort of year 8, year 9 during COVID, we obviously didn't have the same exam series that we would have had in school, those key assessment fortnights. So we didn't have that same expectation of them just sitting and practicing exam conditions. How can we teach students to write long answers? I think for me, it's to start off by scaffolding it. So by taking a question and almost doing, like the gold, silver, bronze problem solving questions that we've got for GCSE in the Emporium, I would do it where I would almost start like that. So a bronze answer is where I've started your sentence for you and you just kind of need to fill the bits in. Then the silver is where I remove a bit of the scaffolding, but I might give them the key words that they need to make sure they've included in their answer. And then the gold one is the one that they'll obviously see in their exam. And I think that's kind of how I've approached it, really, is to think about the scaffolding for those long answers, because actually to ask a student to do just a long answer straight off is actually really difficult. We know it's a problem in science as well with the 6-mark questions, that students find that really difficult. So I think scaffolding it for them and then removing some of that scaffolding as you go. The shadow papers have been updated, so there are some more shadow papers. So there's shadow papers for this series. So again, that's another way of doing some of the extended answers, is go through one of the questions and then give them the shadow question to do alongside it, using the modelled response, the I do, we do, you do approach. So we're going to do one of these together, we're going to write a response together, and then you're going to have a go at the shadow paper question independently on your own. Those have now been updated, the shadow papers, so those are there.